My name is Delphine Marchetti, and at 34 I had designed structural systems holding up 63 mid-rise buildings across 11 states. My brother called me the family disappointment. He said it at his own wedding, in front of 200 guests, standing next to the bride's multimillionaire father. My parents backed him up. My mother added her favorite line, the one she'd been polishing for years. And the man Julian was trying so hard to impress looked at me, went still, and said 5 words that cracked the evening wide open. What happened after that, what it cost Julian, what it cost my parents, what it finally gave me permission to stop carrying, none of them saw coming. I barely did either. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Welcome back to the channel. Quiet stories about ordinary people, impossible families, and the moment the truth finally stands up on its own. If you've ever been the one nobody bragged about, this one's for you. Drop a comment and subscribe. Let me take you back to where it started. 6 weeks before the wedding, on a Tuesday night in March, I was sitting in my apartment in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, eating leftover soup when my phone buzzed with a notification from a group chat I'd been removed from 3 weeks earlier. The Marchetti fam chat. They'd added me back. Not to catch up. Not to apologize. The message from my brother read, "Are you coming or not? Don't make it weird." I hadn't been in that chat since early February. My mother created it 4 years ago, back when Julian launched his startup and suddenly needed a family audience for every milestone photo, every press mention, every round of applause he could manufacture from people who shared his last name. The chat had 280 unread messages when I was removed. I only noticed because the notification badge disappeared. Nobody told me. Nobody had to. I scrolled past Julian's message. Below it my mother had typed, "Delphine. Please just confirm. Isabel's family is very particular about head counts." Isabel Kane, Julian's fiancée, daughter of Nathaniel Kane, the real estate development investor whose fund had reportedly financed 19 mixed-use projects in the last 5 years, most of them built on modular construction systems. I knew the name because everyone in my industry did. Kane Capital was one of the funds that licensed structural frame systems developed by my firm. I didn't think about that connection then. I was too busy reading the next message from my father. Anthony Marchetti, a man who communicated almost exclusively through silence, had typed a single line. It would mean a lot. The most my father had said to me in a text in 2 years. I put the phone down, picked up my soup. The broth had gone cold. Here's what you need to understand about the Marchetti family. We had one success story, and it wasn't me. It was Julian. Julian, who dropped out of a business program to launch FrameRight, a modular construction startup that had raised $9 million and landed on 2 founders to watch lists before his 29th birthday. And me, I was the daughter who built things nobody in my family could see. The last time I went home for dinner was in January. My mother had invited the Delvecchios from next door, nice people, retired, the kind who ask polite questions and actually listen to the answers. Mr. Delvecchio asked what I did for work. Before I could open my mouth, my mother waved her hand like she was swatting a fly. "Oh, Delphine does engineering things, buildings or something." She turned to him with a smile that had been rehearsed in front of a bathroom mirror. "We don't advertise her," she said it lightly, the way you'd say you don't keep dessert in the house. A fact of life, a household policy. Mr. Delvecchio looked uncomfortable. My father studied his meatloaf. Julian, who had driven up from Raleigh for the weekend in a leased BMW, leaned back in his chair and grinned. The rest of dinner was about FrameRight. My mother recited Julian's accomplishments the way a docent walks you through a museum. The seed round, the partnerships, the office space in the innovation district. She left out the part where my parents had pulled $125,000 from their retirement savings to cover his bridge funding gap. I knew about it because my father had mentioned it once, in a phone call so quiet I thought the line had dropped. "We believe in him," he'd said. "Your mother and I, we put in what we had. 125,000. 32 years of a high school shop teacher's pension contributions and a court reporter's overtime pay, converted into equity in a company my brother ran and my mother narrated." I didn't argue. I never did. That was my problem. Not that I trusted them, but that I had stopped expecting anything from them a long time ago. At Halcyon Structural, I was principal structural engineer. I had been there 7 years. The system I built, Trellis, was a load-bearing lattice frame designed to shave weeks off mid-rise construction timelines without sacrificing seismic performance. If you've ever walked into a hospital wing, a student housing complex, or a mixed-use retail building anywhere in the eastern half of this country, there's a reasonable chance my calculations are holding up the ceiling above your head. Nobody at Halcyon. My colleague Deja used to joke that I was the ghost who built the bones of half the skyline nobody looks up at. I designed the skeleton. Other people got to walk around inside the body. That spring, Halcyon's technical director forwarded me an invitation to present at a regional structural engineering summit in Pittsburgh, a keynote panel on lattice frame systems and seismic retrofitting. My name listed alongside a professional engineering award I'd received 2 years earlier. I almost declined. I usually did, not because I couldn't speak in public, I'd done it a dozen times, but because I'd grown so used to being invisible that visibility felt like standing in the wrong lane of traffic. Professional isolation, that's what my therapist called it. She said I'd organized my entire life around being competent and unseen, and that both of those things were costing me something I hadn't calculated yet. I told her I'd caught a critical shear connection error in a peer review that would have compromised a 5-story structure under wind load. Nobody sent me flowers. Nobody posted about it in a group chat. But when I signed off on the corrected calculations and watched the revised drawings get stamped, I felt the quiet satisfaction that only people who build things for a living understand. That was enough. Or I had decided it was. 2 weeks after the group chat reappeared, I drove to my parents' house outside Bethlehem. I told myself it was to drop off a set of replacement furnace filters my father had asked for. That was partly true. Mostly I went because something in my father's 6-word text had pulled at the part of me that still wanted to believe the word family meant something in that house. The living room hadn't changed. Same plaid couch, same brass lamp, and on the mantel above the gas fireplace, a new addition, a Glass and Steel Award engraved Founders to Watch, Lehigh Valley Business Quarterly, this year. It sat between a framed photo of Julian shaking hands with an investor and a candle my mother had never lit. No photos of me on that mantel. Not one. Julian was in the kitchen when I arrived, eating a sandwich my mother had made him. He was 29 years old and still ate sandwiches his mother cut diagonally. He looked up, grinned, and said it like a punchline he'd been saving. "Every family needs one success and one cautionary tale, right, Delph?" My mother laughed. My father looked at his hands. I set the furnace filters on the counter. Before I left, Julian caught me at the door. His grin was gone. He leaned close, voice low. "You're coming to the wedding. I need you there." I asked why. He shrugged, but his eyes didn't match the shrug. Isabel's dad is old school. Wants to see the whole family. Just show up. Be normal. Don't talk about work. Don't talk about work. The one thing I had that was entirely mine, and my brother's instruction was to leave it at the door like muddy boots. For years earlier, Julian had called me at 11 at night. He was 25, 3 months into FrameWrite, and panicking. He'd pitched investors on a proprietary modular frame system, but he didn't have one. What he had was a pitch deck, a rented warehouse, and a plywood mock-up held together with construction adhesive. I just need the core frame geometry, he said. Something I can show in the demo. I'll hire a real engineering team after the round closes. He was my brother. My mother had called me twice that week to tell me Julian was under pressure. My father had sent a rare text. He could use your help, Delph. So I helped. I spent 3 weeks developing a full load-bearing lattice frame design, stress models, connection details, a physical scale prototype, inspired by the design principles I used at Halcyon but built from scratch on my own time, on my own equipment, entirely outside the scope of my employment agreement. I used my own calculation methodology, my own notation, my own detailing conventions, because that's the only kind of engineering I know how to do properly. We signed a consulting agreement. Julian promised a $12,000 fee and co-inventor credit on any resulting patent filing. He paid me $2,000. The credit never appeared. What did appear 14 months later was FrameWrite's provisional patent filing and public product sheet, describing their proprietary structural lattice system, a design I recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting. Same node geometry, same connection detailing, same load path logic in the technical appendix. Julian had built FrameWrite on the frame I gave him. He renamed the product line, changed the marketing renderings, and called it innovation. I said nothing. My mother would have called me jealous. My father would have gone quiet. And Julian would have looked at me with that grin and said something about how family helps family. So I closed the folder on my laptop, filed the consulting agreement in a manila envelope, and went back to building things that worked. That envelope lived in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, under a stack of old permit applications and a warranty card for a laser level I no longer owned. I'd reinforced the corners with packing tape 3 years ago because the flap had torn and I didn't want the pages falling out. Inside, a printed copy of the consulting agreement with Julian's signature and mine, dated 4 years back. A printed set of my original calculation sheets, hand-annotated, my professional engineer stamp pressed into the corner of every page, because even a private consulting job gets my seal if my name is on the math. A 3-page frame design memo I'd written in my own shorthand, margin notes, a coffee ring near the bottom of page 2. And a single printed email from Julian, sent at 2 in the morning. Subject line, can you just make the geometry work? I'll handle the rest. That email was the last honest thing my brother ever wrote me about FrameWrite. I didn't keep the envelope as evidence. I didn't keep it to build a case. I kept it because I keep records of my own work, always have. Every structure I've ever stamped, every calculation set I've ever signed, I archive it. It's the same instinct that makes me back up my drawings in 3 locations and label my own drafting pencils. Soup and the quiet apartment. I opened the bottom drawer, saw the envelope, ran my thumb across the tape, then closed the drawer. Whatever Julian was building or pretending to build, whatever my parents had poured their savings into, it wasn't my problem anymore. I had made my peace with being invisible. Or I thought I had. Deja told me not to go. We were eating lunch in the Halcyon break room, turkey wraps from the place on 3rd Street that put too much mayo on everything, and I told her about the wedding. She set down her wrap and looked at me the way she did when a junior engineer was about to release bad calculations for permit. Why would you go? They treat you like a load you're not accounting for. I couldn't argue with that. But something had shifted in me since January. Maybe it was the therapy. Maybe it was the summit invitation still sitting unanswered in my inbox. Maybe it was just the plain arithmetic of turning 34 and realizing I'd spent a decade making myself smaller so the people around me wouldn't have to feel short. I'm not going to perform small so everyone else feels tall, I told her. Deja raised her eyebrows. That's a bumper sticker. It's also true. I called my mother that afternoon and confirmed I'd attend. She sounded relieved. Not for me, for the head count. Good. Isabel's family is very organized. Don't bring anyone. Don't wear anything attention-getting. And maybe don't mention Halcyon. Julian gets sensitive when people compare. Compare, as if my career and his existed on the same axis. As if holding up buildings and holding up a plywood mock-up were two versions of the same profession. I hung up and sat at my desk for a long time, staring at a load diagram I'd been revising. I almost didn't go. If you've ever talked yourself into shrinking just to keep the peace, you already know that feeling in your chest. Stay with me, because the moment I walked into that reception hall, everything I'd swallowed for years finally had somewhere to land. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how it turned. 3 weeks before the wedding, Framewright was everywhere. Julian landed a feature in a regional business publication, The Steel Whisperer, How One Founder is Rebuilding American Housing from the Frame Up. I read it on my phone during a permit review. The article described Framewright's proprietary lattice frame system as a paradigm shift in modular construction. The technical description they quoted from Julian was almost word for word from the design memo I'd written 4 years earlier. Not the spirit of it. The actual sentences. The article mentioned that Framewright was in advanced discussions with Kane Capital for a significant series around Nathaniel Kane's fund, the same Kane whose developments already used Halcyon's trellis frame system, the system I had designed. The irony wasn't lost on me. It just didn't feel like irony yet. It felt like watching someone wear your coat in a photograph and tell everyone they bought it in Milan. My mother posted the article link in the family chat with a row of champagne emojis and the words, "Our boy." 14 family members reacted with hearts and thumbs up. I didn't react. I didn't have to. Nobody noticed either way. That same week, Julian appeared on a local business podcast. I listened to 38 minutes of my brother describing engineering he didn't perform, solving problems he didn't understand, using terminology he'd learned from the memo I wrote in my apartment while eating reheated risotto at 2 in the morning. He sounded confident. He sounded credible. He sounded like someone who had practiced his lines so many times he'd started to believe them. And the worst part, the part that made my hands tighten around my coffee mug, was that the frame was real. I had made it real. I just wasn't part of the story anymore. My mother called on a Thursday evening. I was reviewing a wind load calculation for Halcyon's spring permit batch. She didn't ask what I was doing. She never did. "Delphine, I need to talk to you about the wedding." Her voice had that particular tightness she reserved for conversations where she needed me to cooperate without asking questions. Isabel's family is important. Nathaniel Kane is, well, he's not like us. He's the kind of man who pays attention. So when you're there, I need you to be supportive. I told her I'd be polite. I don't mean polite. I mean, don't talk about technical things. Don't bring up Halcyon. Don't say anything that makes Julian feel like you're competing. She paused. For once, just let your brother have his moment. For once, as if I had ever tried to take one. I wanted to ask her when exactly she thought I had ever competed with Julian for anything. I wanted to ask her why she'd pulled $125,000 out of retirement to fund a company she couldn't describe in a single accurate sentence. I wanted to ask her what it cost her every time she waved her hand and said she didn't advertise me. But I didn't, because I already knew the answer. My mother had grown up in a family where nobody made it. Her father worked the line at Bethlehem Steel until the plant closed. Her mother cleaned offices downtown. Nobody went to college. Nobody built anything with their name attached to it. Carla Marchetti had spent her whole life terrified of being ordinary, and she had chosen Julian as her proof that she wasn't. If she admitted I was the one who'd built something real, she'd have to admit she'd been investing in the wrong child for 3 decades. That was a debt she couldn't afford to acknowledge. So she covered it with the only currency she had. My silence. 10 days before the wedding, the family chat lit up again. This time it wasn't logistics. It was Julian typing fast, asking if I could take a quick look at some technical documentation before a meeting. He didn't say what meeting. He didn't say with whom. He said it's just a review, an hour max, family. I recognized the pattern. It was the same cadence as 4 years earlier. The same just a quick thing that turned into 3 weeks of building his company's skeleton. I scrolled up through the chat history. They'd kept me out of the planning messages, venue photos, seating charts I wasn't consulted on. And buried between a caterer's menu link and Isabel's note about floral arrangements, a message from Julian to my mother. Don't worry, she won't understand what's happening anyway. She just does the technical drawings. She just does the technical drawings. The math that kept his entire company standing upright was the technical drawings. I typed a reply to his review request. Send me the documents. He sent a 9-page technical summary of Framewright's structural system, the same summary I assumed was heading to Kane Capital. I read it in 18 minutes. He'd gotten the frame overview mostly right, because he was describing my work, but the load capacity projections were inflated. The deflection tolerances were fabricated. And the section labeled Proprietary Innovation described a node connection detail I had published in a Halcyon technical bulletin 2 years earlier. Julian hadn't just borrowed my design. He had built an entire narrative around it. A narrative where he was the engineer and the frame was his invention. And now he needed me to proofread the lie before he handed it to his fiancée's father. I closed the document. I did not reply. The connection I should have made earlier arrived on a Monday morning during a routine staff meeting at Halcyon. Our director of client relations mentioned that Kane Capital had recently renewed their master license for trellis across 3 new developments. They're one of our longest-standing frame clients, she said. Nathaniel Kane apparently reviewed the structural calculations himself when they first signed. He told our business development team it was some of the cleanest frame engineering he'd seen in 20 years. She looked at me. That was your work, Delphine. I nodded, took a sip of coffee, didn't say anything, but a small cold wire connected 2 points in my head that I'd been keeping separate. Nathaniel Kane knew trellis. Nathaniel Kane was about to invest in Framewright. Framewright's frame was trellis's younger sibling. Same node geometry, same load logic, same handwriting. If Kane's team ran any kind of serious structural due diligence on FrameRite, they would find detailing conventions and geometric ratios that matched Trellis's engineering at a foundational level. And if they traced the authorship of that engineering back to its stamp, they would find the name D. Marchetti, P.E. My name. I sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a headache you're not ready to take medicine for. Aware of it, uncomfortable, choosing not to act. It wasn't my job to police my brother's company. It wasn't my responsibility to call his investors and tell them the frame system they were evaluating was designed by someone who was never credited, never paid in full, and never mentioned in any of FrameRite's filings. The truth was sitting in my bottom drawer inside a taped-up envelope, waiting for nobody. If it mattered, it would surface through the right channels. If it didn't, I would go on building things that worked and letting other people take credit. I had done it before. 2 weeks before the wedding, the pressure from my family shifted from passive to active. Julian texted me directly. Not the group chat, not through my mother, a private message at 9 at night. Be there by 4. Sit where they tell you. Don't be late, and don't overdress. Isabel's family notices everything. I read the message twice. My brother was managing me like a structural member he didn't understand the tolerances of. I almost laughed. Then my father called. It was the second time he'd called me voluntarily in over a year. His voice was careful the way it got when he was trying to say something important without actually saying it. Delphine, your mother and I, we've got a lot riding on this. The wedding, the business, all of it. He paused. I just need this to work out for him. We put everything in. Everything. He meant the $125,000. He meant the retirement account that now depended on Julian's startup being worth what Julian said it was worth. He meant the bet he and my mother had placed on their golden child, a bet they couldn't unwind without admitting they'd been wrong for a decade. I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, a dull, heavy sadness, like holding a load that was too heavy for the connection detail underneath it. My parents were scared. They were 61 and 63 years old, and they'd traded their security for a company built on borrowed engineering and inflated numbers. They didn't know that. They couldn't know that, because the only person who understood what FrameRite actually was, what it was built on, where its frame geometry came from, what its real capabilities were, was the daughter they didn't advertise. The message arrived on a Wednesday morning. It came through LinkedIn, a connection request followed by a note from someone named Priyanka Osei, Director of Technical Diligence at Kane Capital. The note was professional, neutral, specific. Ms. Marchetti. Our firm is conducting a structural technical assessment of a portfolio candidate in the modular housing space. During our review, we identified frame geometry, node detailing, and load path conventions that closely align with published engineering attributed to your work on the trellis system at Halcyon Structural. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss provenance and authorship of certain foundational design elements. This is a standard part of our due diligence process. Could you make yourself available for a brief call this week? I read it 3 times. My heart rate stayed steady. Years of reading load diagrams under deadline had given me that, but my hands moved before my thoughts caught up. I opened the bottom drawer, pulled out the taped envelope, laid it flat on my desk, and opened it for the first time in over a year. The consulting agreement, Julian's signature, slanted and hurried. My signature, neat, dated 4 years ago. The calculation sheets, stamped, sealed, my professional engineer license number pressed into the corner of every page. The design memo, 3 pages, my handwriting in the margins, the coffee ring still dark near the bottom of page 2. And Julian's email. "Can you just make the geometry work?" Everything was there. It had always been there. The envelope wasn't a weapon. It was a record, the same kind of record I kept for every structure I've ever designed. Timestamps, authorship, stamped documentation. The difference was that this particular record now sat at the exact intersection of my brother's ambition and his investor's due diligence. I hadn't put it there. The truth had just walked itself into the room. I closed the envelope. I did not reply to Priyanka Ose that day. I spent 2 days thinking about that LinkedIn message. Not because the answer was complicated. The answer was simple. Yes, I designed the frame. Here are the stamped records. The hard part was the math around it. If I confirmed authorship to Kane's analyst, the due diligence report would flag Framewright's IP provenance as unresolved. An unresolved IP flag in a series around wasn't a speed bump. It was a load-bearing wall removed without shoring. The investment would stall, maybe collapse. Julian's company, the one my parents had staked their retirement on, the one my mother recited like scripture, the one my brother had built his entire identity around, would face the kind of scrutiny that borrowed engineering doesn't survive. And everyone would blame me. My mother would say I did it out of jealousy. My father would go silent in a way that felt worse than shouting. Julian would tell anyone who listened that his sister sabotaged him because she couldn't handle his success. I sat at my desk for a long time, looking at the cursor blinking on a blank drawing sheet. Then I opened a text editor and typed a sentence I didn't send to anyone. It was just for me. I will not lie about my own work. That was the whole of it. I wasn't going to call Kane Capital and volunteer a confession. I wasn't going to march into Julian's office with the envelope and demand credit. But if someone from the investors team asked me a direct question about engineering I had designed and stamped, I was going to tell the truth. I wasn't going to lie about my own work. Not for Julian, not for my mother, not for a family that had spent a decade pretending I didn't exist. I replied to Priyanka Ose. I said I was available Thursday. The rehearsal dinner was held inside a restored blast furnace hall on the old Steel Stacks campus, exposed iron trusses 40 feet overhead, string lights strung between girders that had once poured molten ore. Isabel had hired a calligrapher for the place cards. I found mine at a table near the service entrance, wedged between a second cousin I'd met once and a college friend of Isabel's who spent the evening on her phone. Julian and Isabel sat at the head table with Nathaniel and Isabel's mother, Corinne. My parents sat one table over, close enough to orbit, far enough to earn. When introductions went around the room, Julian stood up and worked the crowd with the ease of someone who had practiced charm the way I practiced structural review, repetition, iteration, polish. He introduced his parents with warmth. He introduced Isabel's family with reverence. When he got to me, he paused. And this is my sister, Delphine. She does drafting, technical stuff. A polite ripple of smiles. One man at a corner table, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, name tag I couldn't read from my seat, tilted his head slightly when he heard my name. Not a reaction exactly, more like recognition catching on a snag. The dinner moved on. Toasts were given. Julian told a story about how Framewright almost didn't survive its first demo, but he pulled an all-nighter and made it happen. I ate my chicken. I did not correct him. After dinner, as guests drifted toward the parking lot, the man with wire-rimmed glasses passed my table, stopped. Delphine Marchetti? I nodded. I think I saw your name on a lattice frame seismic panel 2 years ago in Cincinnati. Retrofit performance under cyclic loading. I nodded again. He smiled, small, knowing, and walked away. I never got his name, but someone in that room had recognized mine, and for a reason that had nothing to do with Julian. On the drive home from the rehearsal, I put the pieces together. Not all at once, more like tiles clicking into a mosaic I'd been assembling without realizing I was building anything. Julian didn't invite me to the wedding because he wanted me there. He invited me because he needed Nathaniel Kane to see a complete family. A normal family. A family that showed up, smiled, and didn't say anything inconvenient. But more than that, he needed me to be small. Visibly, publicly, undeniably small. Because if Delphine Marchetti ever came up in conversation with Nathaniel Kane's technical team, Julian needed the room's memory of me to be a quiet woman at a back table who did drafting, a nobody, a family footnote, a cautionary tale. If I was already labeled, if everyone had already seen me dismissed and diminished and introduced as an afterthought, then anything I said later about frame rights engineering would sound like bitterness, like jealousy, like a failure trying to drag down a success. That was the strategy. Not conscious, maybe. Julian wasn't a planner, but he had the instincts of someone who had survived by controlling the narrative. And the narrative required me in the room, wearing my assigned role like a hard hat 2 sizes too small. What my brother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Nathaniel Kane's team had already been in my inbox. The due diligence was already running. And the engineer whose stamp was flagged in their technical review wasn't an anonymous contractor or a disgruntled ex-employee. She was sitting at table 12 eating chicken, being introduced as the family disappointment. The collision was coming. I hadn't arranged it. I hadn't planned it. I had simply stopped being willing to lie about what I'd built. And the truth, as it tends to do, was finding its own way to the surface. The wedding was held at Kane Estate, 18 acres of restored orchard, a converted grain mill, and a reception hall with exposed timber trusses and windows tall enough to make you feel like you'd been miniaturized. A string quartet played something soft near the entrance. Champagne flutes stood at attention on silver trays carried by staff in black vests. Everything about the setting announced money that had been around long enough to stop announcing itself. I arrived at 4 wearing a charcoal dress I'd bought 2 years ago for a conference I'd ended up skipping. Simple, clean lines, no jewelry except a watch my grandmother had given me. My mother would have preferred I'd worn something that faded further into the background. I chose the dress because it was mine and I liked it, and I was done dressing for her comfort. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. Isabel looked luminous. Julian looked like a man who had rehearsed his tears. My parents sat in the second row, my mother in a rust-colored suit she'd bought for the occasion, my father in a tie that didn't quite match his shirt. They looked proud. They looked invested in every sense of the word. I sat 4 rows back between strangers, watching my brother promise to love and cherish a woman whose father ran the fund that was about to evaluate whether his company was real. I want you to picture it. Timber trusses, a string quartet, and me, the one they told to keep quiet. I almost turned around at the door. If a part of you has ever stood at the edge of a room wondering if you belong, stay with me. What the bride's father said next changed which side of that room I stood on. Comment truth if you're rooting for her. The reception began at 6. Tables were arranged in concentric arcs around a dance floor. My seat was at the outer ring, table 14, near a side exit and a potted fig tree. Julian had assigned my placement personally. He told me this with a smile when he found me holding a glass of water near the bar. You're at 14. Great spot. You can see the whole room. I could also be seen by nobody. He took my elbow lightly, performatively, and began walking me through the crowd. This was his show. I was a prop. He introduced me to Isabel's aunt. This is my sister. She's in it. He introduced me to a groomsman. Delphine. She's the quiet one. He introduced me to a couple I didn't recognize. Family's engineer. Never leaves the drafting table. Each introduction was a small, precise cut, friendly enough to pass for humor, sharp enough to draw blood. My parents trailed behind us. My mother smiled and nodded. My father looked at his shoes. When Isabel's mother asked me what I did, my mother jumped in before I could answer. She does technical support, I think. Something like that. I let it land. I let all of it land. But when Julian squeezed my arm and leaned in to whisper, "See, nobody cares, Delph, just relax," I pulled my arm free. Not dramatically, not with a scene. Just enough that he felt the absence. "You can introduce me," I said quietly. "You don't get to script me." He blinked. Then the grin came back, the one that had been protecting him from accountability since childhood. "Relax, sis. It's a party." He walked away. I stayed where I was, standing full height, drinking water, waiting. Nathaniel Kane entered the reception at 6:30. He had been taking photographs with the wedding party, and his arrival shifted the energy in the room the way a current shifts the surface of a lake, subtle, total. He was taller than I'd expected, gray at the temples, wore his suit like it owed him nothing. His handshake when he greeted people was brief and direct. He didn't smile reflexively. He read the room before the room read him. Isabel kissed his cheek and brought him to a table where my parents were already seated, champagne in hand, performing their best version of a family with nothing to hide. Julian was magnetic in that moment, standing taller, speaking louder, telling a story about Framewright's latest municipal contract that I happened to know was still in the letter of intent stage. Nathaniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod along. He just watched Julian the way an engineer watches a structure under load, looking for where the strain would show. I wasn't supposed to be nearby. My table was across the room, but the bar was between them and me, and I was still holding my glass of water when Julian spotted me. His eyes lit up, not with affection, with utility. "Nathaniel, come here, you haven't met my sister yet." He said it to Nathaniel, but it was aimed at me. He reached out and pulled me toward the circle the way you'd yank a stuck drawer. Functional, graceless, purposeful. Nathaniel turned. My mother straightened in her chair. My father set down his champagne glass. And Julian, grinning so wide his molars caught the overhead light, positioned me in front of the man whose fund was about to make or break his entire company. Julian had one hand on my shoulder and the other holding a champagne flute. He turned to Nathaniel with the grin, the one that was half charm and half armor, and said it clearly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "This is our family disappointment." He laughed, the kind of laugh designed to give other people permission to laugh too. A few guests obliged. My mother, seated 3 feet away, tipped her glass slightly and added her signature line, the one she had tested at dinner tables and church functions and neighborhood barbecues until it had the smooth delivery of a campaign slogan. "We don't advertise her," she said to Nathaniel's wife, Corinne, who smiled politely. She said it the way she always said it, as a kindness, as modesty, as a mother who simply had one child worth discussing and one she kept in the margins. My father looked at his plate. Julian squeezed my shoulder. I stood still. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't perform the role I'd been assigned. The good-natured sister who absorbs the joke, who plays along, who makes the golden child shine brighter by standing in his shadow. I stood with my back straight and my hands at my sides and my face absolutely neutral. 34 years of being the punchline, and I was finished laughing on cue. Nathaniel Kane had not spoken. He had watched Julian deliver the line. He had watched my mother at hers. And now he turned slowly, the way someone turns when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew about the room they're standing in, and looked directly at me. Not at Julian. Not at my parents. At me. His expression changed. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a double take. His brow drew together. His lips pressed thin. He went completely still. Nathaniel Kane spoke quietly. The string quartet had paused between movements, and his voice carried further than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as far as he intended. So it's you. This is unexpected. 2 sentences. That's all it took to tilt the room. Julian's grin froze. My mother set down her champagne glass. Corinne Kane looked at her husband with an expression that said she had seen this particular stillness before and knew what it preceded. I'm sorry, Julian said. He was still smiling, but the smile had detached from the rest of his face. Do you two know each other? Nathaniel didn't look at Julian. He was still looking at me. Delphine Marchetti, he said. Not a question. A confirmation. Trellis. Halcyon structural. I nodded. Yes. Your frame system runs across 7 of my developments. 8, I said. Ridgemont Commons converted to it in January. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something closer to the expression of a man who has just realized the calculation he's been running has a variable he missed. Priyanka's report flagged the provenance issue last week, he said, almost to himself. I assumed the Dia Marchetti in the stamp records was a former contractor or a coincidence. He looked at Julian, then back at me. You're his sister? Yes. And you designed the foundational frame geometry that FrameWrite's system is based on. I didn't hesitate. I didn't soften it. I didn't dress it up or qualify it or add caveats to protect anyone's feelings. I designed the original frame. The consulting agreement is dated 4 years ago. The stamped calculations are mine. The room had gotten very quiet, not silent. There was still the clink of glasses somewhere, still the murmur of guests who hadn't noticed. But the circle around us, Julian, my parents, Corinne, Nathaniel, and me, had become its own atmosphere. Julian moved first. He stepped between me and Nathaniel, his body language shifting from charming host to cornered animal in the space of a breath. Okay, hold on. Hold on. She's exaggerating. She helped with an early prototype. That's it. Everything FrameWrite is today, the frame, the product, the platform, that's my team, my vision. She drew a few sketches 4 years ago. He looked at Nathaniel with a version of the grin that had stopped working. You know how it is. Family members always think they contributed more than they did. Nathaniel tilted his head. The frame geometry in your system matches Trellis's published detailing at a structural level. Priyanka's report identified node ratios, connection tolerances, and load path logic that are functionally identical. He paused. Can you explain the sheer connection detail at the primary node? Julian blinked. The engineering team handles the specifics. I'm the CEO. I focus on strategy. And the connection detail, Nathaniel said, not unkind, just precise. Your documentation calls it proprietary. Can you describe how it distributes load? Julian opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked at me, not with hatred, not yet, but with the panicked recognition of a man who has run out of runway and can see the trees. My mother stood up from her chair. Nathaniel, this is a wedding. This isn't the time for Carla, my father said quietly. It was the first word he'd spoken in 20 minutes. She stopped. Nathaniel looked at me again. Ms. Marchetti, I'm going to ask you something directly. I met his eyes. Go ahead. Is the core frame system of FrameWrite your original work? Yes, I said it the way I would answer a question in a peer review, clearly, specifically, without emotion. The core frame system of FrameWrite is based on a lattice design I developed over 3 weeks, 4 years ago. The geometry follows a specification I wrote myself. The calculations bear my professional engineering stamp. I signed a consulting agreement with my brother which he did not honor. Partial payment, no co-inventor credit. The design was never formally assigned to FrameWrite. I built it on my own time, on my own equipment, outside the scope of my halcyon employment agreement. And the intellectual property was never transferred. I wasn't performing. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't tearful or triumphant or shaking with vindication. I was answering a direct question with documented facts. That was the only tool I'd ever needed. Julian's face went red. You're doing this here, at my wedding. You asked me to come. I came. You introduced me to your investor. He asked me a question. I answered it. You planned this. I didn't plan anything. I don't lie about my own work. Not for anyone. Julian turned to Nathaniel. She's bitter. Look, this is a family issue. Whatever she thinks the IP was never assigned, Nathaniel said, cutting him off with the gentle finality of a man who had spent 30 years reading contracts. If the core structural design isn't owned by the company, the investment can't proceed. This isn't personal. It's due diligence. My mother's face had gone the color of chalk. My father was looking at me, not with anger, but with something that might have been the first stage of understanding. The room felt smaller. The quartet had started again, something classical, and the melody floated over the silence between us like a hand reaching across a table nobody was sitting at. What happened next didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, the way a structure settles before it fails. Cracks first, then creaks, then the slow, irreversible shifting of weight that was never distributed correctly. Nathaniel stepped back from Julian. Not physically, he was already standing apart, but his posture changed. His shoulders squared, his hands clasped behind his back. It was the posture of a man who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. Julian, I want to be clear, Nathaniel said. His voice was low, measured, without heat. Our fund's investment in FrameWrite was contingent on clean IP ownership. The preliminary flag in Priyanka's report was serious enough that I raised it with your team last Tuesday. Your chief engineer told me the frame system was developed in-house. That is demonstrably not the case. Julian shook his head violently. She's lying. She's doing this because she's jealous of everything She's not lying, Nathaniel said, without raising his voice. I've used her frame system. I've read her calculation sets. I know what her engineering looks like from the inside. Your system is her work. That sentence landed on the room like a beam dropped into a foundation trench. Ripples went outward. Guests at the nearest tables had stopped talking. Isabel, who had been dancing with a cousin, noticed the silence and started walking toward us. My mother stood frozen, one hand on the back of her chair, her mouth slightly open, a woman watching the investment she had made in her own story collapse in real time. My father was staring at the floor, his hands were shaking. And Julian, who had charmed investors and reporters and municipal planning boards. Julian, who had built a career on the foundation. I'd poured in the narrative he'd constructed on top of it, was unraveling. Julian turned on me. His face was the color of raw brick, and his voice had climbed into a register I hadn't heard since we were children, and he'd broken something he couldn't blame on the dog. You did this on purpose. You came here to ruin this for me. I didn't respond. You couldn't stand it. You never could. You sit in your little office drawing your little lines, and you can't handle that I'm the one who actually made something of himself. Julian. Nathaniel's voice was a flat wall. Julian spun toward the display table near the entrance, the one arranged with photos of him and Isabel, a guest book, a champagne tower, and a scale architectural model of Framewright's flagship development, the one that had lived on my parents' mantel before being transported to the venue like a sacred relic. Julian grabbed it. I don't think he meant to throw it. I think he meant to hold it up as proof. Proof that he was real, that what he'd built was real, that the balsa wood and acrylic meant more than a stamped calculation sheet in a taped-up envelope. But his hands were shaking and the model was heavier than his rage accounted for, and it slipped. It hit the marble edge of the display table and the roofline shattered off, tiny acrylic windows scattering across the floor like beads off a broken string. The sound cut through the reception, small and sharp. Fragments slid across the marble in every direction. Isabel stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the dance floor, her dress pulled around her feet, staring at the man she was supposed to have married that afternoon. And the look on her face wasn't anger. It was recalibration. The same expression I'd seen on Nathaniel's face minutes before, the expression of someone running the numbers again and arriving at a different total. Nobody moved. The quartet kept playing, and among the broken model pieces on the marble floor, the word Framewright was still legible on one of the larger fragments of the base. My mother broke first, not with tears, with strategy. She crossed the floor toward Nathaniel, heels clicking on the marble, champagne-stained napkins still clutched in her left hand, and did what she had always done. She tried to renegotiate reality. Nathaniel, please, this is a family matter. Delphine has always had issues. She's jealous. She's competitive. She doesn't understand business. Mrs. Marchetti, Nathaniel's voice was not unkind. Your daughter's frame system is licensed across 8 of my developments. Her published detailing is referenced in 2 national code adoption papers. The buildings she's engineered hold more square footage than any product in my current portfolio. He paused. I don't know what she is in your family. But in my industry, she's one of the most respected structural engineers on the East Coast. My mother's mouth opened, closed. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for one fraction of a second I saw something behind the performance. Fear. The pure, uncut terror of a woman who has spent 30 years constructing a story about who her children are and has just heard a stranger dismantle it with facts she can't argue with. Then it was gone. Her face hardened. Well, if she's so successful, why didn't she ever say something? Why didn't she help her brother properly? There it was. Even now, even with the model shattered and the investor pulling away and the entire narrative in pieces around her feet, my mother found a way to make it my fault. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. The envelope existed. The calculation sheets existed. The consulting agreement existed. I hadn't needed to bring any of them to the wedding, because the truth had done its own audit. Nathaniel's team had asked the right questions. I had answered honestly. That was all. The money came up the way money always does in families that have staked everything on a single bet. Not in a boardroom, but in a hallway, between courses, in voices too loud for the setting and too quiet for the magnitude of what had been lost. My father pulled me aside near the coat room. His tie was loosened. His eyes were wet. The retirement money, he said. We put in 125,000. Your mother and I. We believed him. I nodded. I know. Is it gone? I don't know, Dad. That depends on what Framewright has left without the cane round. He leaned against the wall. He looked old, older than 63, older than a man should look at his son's wedding. And for a moment I felt the weight of something I hadn't expected. Grief. Not for what Julian had done to me, for what my parents had done to themselves. My mother appeared at the end of the hallway. She walked toward us with the particular urgency of a woman who has just lost control of a situation and is looking for someone to contain. Delphine, you need to fix this. I didn't break it. Mom. You didn't have to come here. You told me to come. Julian told me to come. You added me back to the group chat so I could confirm my attendance at an event where my job was to stand still and be small. Her eyes flickered, something beneath the armor, just for a heartbeat. I just wanted one thing to be proud of, she said. Her voice cracked. It was the most honest sentence she had ever spoken to me. Then she straightened her shoulders, blinked twice, and said, You should have stayed quiet. You owed us that. The moment was gone. The wall was back up. I turned and walked toward the exit. Nathaniel found me near the front entrance. I was standing under the portico, my car keys in my hand, the cool evening air pulling at the hem of my dress. The estate grounds were lit with landscape lighting that turned the old orchard trees into something out of a painting, beautiful, staged, entirely for someone else's benefit. Ms. Marchetti. I turned. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. Behind him, through the glass doors, I could see the reception continuing, diminished, confused, but continuing. Isabel was sitting at a table with her mother. Julian was nowhere visible. I want to be straightforward with you, Nathaniel said. The investment in Framewright is not proceeding. That decision was made before tonight, based on the technical review. What happened in there didn't change the outcome. It just accelerated the timeline. I nodded. I also want to say I owe you an apology. Not for the due diligence, that's process. But for not connecting the name on the report to the person in the room sooner. I should have reached out to you directly before tonight. You didn't know I was his sister. No, but I should have made the connection. Priyanka's report was thorough. The authorship was clear. He paused. For what it's worth, your work speaks for itself. It always has. I didn't need Nathaniel Kane's validation. I had built Trellis without it. I had built a career without it. I had stood in that reception hall and answered his question without needing anyone's permission or approval. But hearing a man who read balance sheets the way I read load diagrams acknowledge the engineering of what I had built, that wasn't nothing. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. I walked to my car. I came when I was told to. I was leaving because I chose to. The fallout arrived the way structural failure arrives, in stages, each one adding certainty to a picture that was already clear to anyone paying attention. Kane Capital formally withdrew from Frameright Series A within 72 hours. The stated reason was neutral, unresolved IP provenance, but in the industry, neutral language is its own kind of verdict. 2 other investors who had been circling pulled back within a week. The regional business publication that had profiled Julian as the Steel Whisperer ran a follow-up that was significantly less flattering. Frameright didn't collapse overnight. These things rarely do. But the scaffolding was gone, and what remained was a company without clean ownership of its core technology, without its lead investor, and without the narrative that had been holding it together. The wedding was annulled within the month. Isabel moved back into her parents' estate. I don't know whether she and Julian spoke after that night. That wasn't my business to track. In the family chat, the one I'd been removed from, added back to, and never once genuinely included in, my parents sent me a message for the first time that had nothing to do with Julian. My father wrote, "Are you doing all right, Delph?" My mother wrote nothing for 3 days. "Then, you could have told us." I replied once. I'm open to talking when the conversation starts with respect. Not before. Nobody responded. That was fine. I wasn't waiting for an answer. I was setting a boundary, the kind I should have set a decade earlier, the kind you can only set once you've stopped believing you deserve the silence people have been giving you. I went back to Halcyon the following Monday. Trellis was still running, holding up 8 developments, 63 buildings, 0 fanfare. Deja brought me a coffee and didn't ask about the wedding. She just sat next to me at my desk and said, "You look like someone who finally exhaled." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in a week. The summit invitation was still in my inbox, the one in Pittsburgh, the keynote panel on lattice frame systems and seismic retrofitting. I accepted it that afternoon, not because Nathaniel Kane's words had given me permission, not because Julian's collapse had made me brave, because I had spent a decade designing systems that held the weight of entire buildings, and I had done it while my family called me a disappointment to my face, and I was finished letting their vocabulary define mine. The failure was never me. The failure was a family that measured worth by volume, by who talked the loudest, who raised the most money, who could fill a room with the sound of their own mythology. I had filled rooms with structure, with reliability, with the kind of quiet, invisible work that people only notice when it breaks. And mine never broke. Your worth was never something they had to advertise for it to be real. It was always doing its quiet work, steady as a load path, with or without their applause. That's my story. A taped-up envelope I almost threw away. A room that told me to stay small. And a truth that stood up on its own when I finally stopped holding it down. If you've ever been the one nobody bragged about, let this be your sign. Stop shrinking. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.